everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Joe Mooney. I'm the Director of Communications for the USA chapter of the Institute of Asset Management. Today, we're very pleased to have Martin Kerr, a member of the Australian delegation to the ISO TC251, the committee that manages the ISO standard for asset management. He's also president of Structured Change, and he will discuss how this technical specification was developed and how you can adopt it in your organization from the lens of change management. Thank you very much, Martin. I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thanks very much, Joe. I'll just change a few things here. And if you could just hand over control to me, I think, and then I'm ready to go.
All right. I'm guessing, Rob, are you handing control to Martin?
Let me see. Yeah, I can't get to the take control. Right. One moment there. Sorry, everybody. Just go through and go make presenter. Here we go.
All right.
Let me go to here. Okay. Just wait for the screen to warm up. So thank you very much for that introduction, Joe, and apologies, I was just on the phone then to Tom Smith in the background. He's having some technical difficulties at his end. Again, it's great pleasure and I suppose a privilege to share with you some of the insights from in and around 55010. I've been on the TC251 committee now for approximately 2 years. And what I want to share with you this afternoon is some of those insights as how that standard, or sorry, the technical specification came to be. But I also want to weave into that through the lens of change management, some of the work we're doing around the New South Wales state government and Treasury and how 55010 is coming to life. So bit of a skeleton for today, bit of a TC251 overview, just so those that aren't aware of how ISO is, I suppose, set up to develop standards and specifications. I'm going to talk then about the need for alignment, the benefits of alignment, and if you cast your mind back to 55,000, it's one of the 4 fundamentals. We've got alignment, assurance, leadership, and value, and alignment plays a key piece. What does 55010 provide? Again, I'm going to look at through the lens of someone trying to implement change in an organization and how I have found this specification to be of great aid, especially bringing together finance and treasury with asset management. And I'll paint some of the symptoms that we faced in doing this, but also to how we navigated around it. And then finally, I'll open up with some questions and then return to Joe. So a bit about TC251, as you can see, it was established in 2015 when it moved from being a project committee to a technical committee because the standard was published in 2014. Got 35 members, 16 observer countries, and the liaisons into and out of TC251 means that the standard and the specification isn't done in just isolation with asset management folk. It's done in coordination or at least awareness of things like safety, the standard structure of ISO, quality, safety, etc. So that's what a liaison means in the context of ISO. Our structure, and this is as recent as November last year, and as we all know, the world's kind of slowed down a bit in the past few months, but we have what's called work groups within ISO. Especially TC251, I sit predominantly in work group 3, and for those I'm sure who know Budwin, he's my boss in ISO. But being in the work group 3 communications committee or sub working group, I have the opportunity to go around and sit in the different work groups, which has been a real eye-opener for me. Not just so much in the topic areas and the knowledge from those individuals, but it's I suppose it's how the world has come together and embraced asset management and shifted it away from just the management of assets to an organisational concern. Today, as you can see on that slide with the new, we'll be talking about 55010. So on this next slide, we're just going to talk very briefly around the publication process. We don't just come up with an idea and then pump out a spec or a new standard. It goes through a rigorous process. And the process around Workgroup 5 or finance commenced back in 2015. And then of course was published late last year in 2019. The convener on that group, Peter Way, who I've got to know very well over the last few years and continue to keep in contact with him. I think he and the team did a brilliant job of bringing together what is a very usable specification. And as I said, brings finance together with the business. And in a way, shifts finance from just being a controlling function to more of an assurance function. And I'll explain that as we get through the slide deck. As you can see here, we've got the pie charts here just representing the different utilization of ISO and the certifications. And I think one call out here is that the electricity and utility functions has actually pipped water for the first time. So that was around the other way. And again, it's not a race or anything, but it just demonstrates where I suppose the uptake of ISO has been, and I suppose where we feel we're getting value from it. As you can see there, all the way down even to health. You think about the health might be the minimum one there at the organisations per sector, but I can say down in Australia and New South Wales in particular, the new Treasury function, which stipulates that you must put forward a business case for your spend, and it doesn't matter what sector you're in government, your AMP or your asset management plan doesn't just determine your maintenance for budget, it actually now determines the TOTEX for both your maintenance and operations. So I'll cover some themes around TOTEX as we move through this afternoon. The TC251 structure, slightly different to the standard Annexure SL structure. 1 to 3 are pretty normal. You know, the scope, the normative references of which is 55,000. We then have a section, and I can't put it all on here because of course it's ISO IP, but why alignment between the financial and non-financial is so important and calling out those benefits. The enablers around process, leadership, policy, strategy, data and information. And data and information play a key role in all this because when we're moving to a world that needs to justify TOTEX, you do need solid information. It's no longer subjective and, as we say, a wet finger in the air. You do need to quantify your investments, and at least for the New South Wales Treasury policy, that means that everything that you ask for money upon must exist in your asset register. Of course, how to achieve that system alignment through data and information. And that's not to discount knowledge that we all have in our own minds, but again, we need quantitative information. How to achieve an asset register related alignment. And as you can see, that's always a challenge. And I'll talk about that as well, how in finance, we seem to have a bias always around cost centers. But if I'm an asset manager, I'm more interested in a cost around an asset, discrete, a subsystem, a system, etc. So it's really being able to have that conversation in your organization to bring those two together. And it'll be a compromise. You won't get a perfect, unless you're going to run 2 balance sheets, you won't get a perfect match. We talk about financial planning, budgeting. And I think the word we use down here in Australia at the moment is shifting from just budgeting to forecasting. What is that future spend? What are some of the options that I can actually place into my business case? Again, moving the AMP from just being a budgeting artifact for maintenance to whole of life service and asset management planning. And of course, how do we actually track that performance in the context of finance and asset management? Okay, we won't get onto that today, but how important lead indicators become. You know, it's not just what you've spent, it's what we need to spend in the future, considering of cash flow, And rather holding contingency because we don't understand our planning, it's about the effective and the responsible allocation of funds, be it investment or be it operational and recurrent cost. So moving into the, I suppose, more of the nitty gritty. Okay, why is there a need for greater alignment between finance and asset? Well, there is a continuing tension between the available funds and, as we say, the system and asset need. It's not all about the discrete physical asset. It's about the system in which that asset supports and understanding that connection. Again, alignment. Finance, as I mentioned before, around control, centered around budget, cash flow, the balance sheet, compliance, but really, how about we shift it to the next line? This is about asset management, or asset is the focus around cost, risk, and performance, and the assurance to get the outcome from the asset based on the investment, not just the function of the asset. Finance, and again, every organization is pretty much the same in that you want to get a business case that supports something. But the old, or I suppose the consistent way of internal rate of return or net present value and return on investment needs to be brave enough to look beyond just the budget cycle to more of the asset life cycle or the system life cycle, or perhaps the decision life cycle. Again, asset management seeks a whole of life perspective. It's non-linear, and I say that because so many variables will happen over time. You know, wherever we are in the world right now, I suppose there has been an impact to the operations and the maintenance of our assets through to utilization with COVID-19. I mean, we didn't see that coming. And again, that's another example of non-linear. In Australia, we've had a lot of bushfires and floods in the past 6 months. So how do we actually factor in these changes? Where have I got enough control and assurance in my processes to actually move money around in the immediate to accommodate for these, I suppose, short cycle events? And the next line, very important, and it's one that, you know, we're starting to use the word grapple with here in Australia, and that is OPEX and CAPEX decisions and TOTEX. And I use the term there, we place the burden of OPEX and CAPEX decisions on the shoulders of an asset manager. And what I draw that out even stronger to say that if I'm an asset manager, it should not really concern me that I'm at the end of a budget cycle or at the beginning of budget cycle, that I need to start playing off capital investment versus operational expenditure. I should just be able to express the need for that asset or that system in terms of TOTEX. Shift the actual decision around timing back to finance and allow us to all have boundaries between our functions to get the most value out of our functions, which also steers towards greater accountability. You know, I'm speaking to North America today from Australia, and, you know, we have an accrual-based system, whereas there's a cash-based system elsewhere in the world. How does that factor into, I suppose, that decision-making and how we, I suppose, treat the value of an asset today and into the future? And why that's very important is because a lot of organizations exist all around the world. I do work with a very large mining company, and they're based around the world, and they have to consider those exact barriers, I suppose, and constraints of how they report accounting, but also how they make decisions at the local operational front. And of course, the world is changing, and we're getting smaller, more connected, and our decisions need to almost be instantaneous. So, of course, you know, there's some of the challenges, some of the benefits of alignment. As you can see, understanding and acceptance of longer term planning, future value, being brave enough to actually commit to future value, even though it might be outside of the budget cycle, but having your SAMP or your AMP connected in such a way that it paints a future picture, so there is an appetite to invest in that future and not just within the budget cycle we're in. And that's to the next line, moving beyond just our local 12 months or 3-month budget cycles and using the asset life cycle to consider what that horizon might be. I did some work with a finance person in Sydney Roads, and what we did was he didn't understand the concept of Weibull analysis or Weibull analysis, where you got a bathtub curve. How does an asset's characteristics fade towards the end? If it's hard time replacement, it will be at a particular point in time. But if it's a bridge, it'll drift off very slowly. Where if it's an IT asset, it will have a shorter life cycle, and the bathtub curve will almost be vertical at either end. We actually modeled some of the asset classes, and from that, we're actually able to start informing finance to how asset management thinks and vice versa. That was a great exercise. And again, that heightened awareness of how asset managers think to how finance think. It was a really good exercise and an easy one to do in any organization. Improve that decision making and communication on how to price our products and services. Sustained competitive advantage, because we know what we're doing. And everyone's got the same crystal ball, but if you've got processes that really link in those stakeholder requirements through your SAMP and AMP, you have really got organizational resilience to do that. I use the term positive tension between our various functions in the business. Whilst this talks about asset managers and finance, let's talk about other entities like supply chain. It's where we make and lose money every day. But this standard can also support that. Sorry, this specification supports that. Collaboration between internal stakeholders. And I use that clarity and transparency. Let me know how you think about this particular problem or this investment, and I'll share with you how I think about this same problem or opportunity, and let's work together. And that really has been, I suppose, at the essence of 55010. Again, shifting from cost to value. It's so easy. When I go to different organizations, each organization will have a bias towards cost, performance, risk. You know, the defense over here, very much around performance, government around cost, mining, risk. But we need to collectively shift towards value, which really is that organizational lead concern or lead indicator for coming together and make informed investment decisions. And from a change management perspective, visibility brings trust and improved organizational culture. That positive challenge across the business promotes innovation. Because if we tighten everything down to always controlling, we lose the opportunity to innovate. I heard someone else say in another organization not so long ago, we need to create freedom within a framework. It can't all be control. We need to shift the dial back and also acknowledge assurance. And of course, moving from lag to lead indicators. I'd love to talk more about that, but that's another story. But yeah, feeling comfortable to move towards lead indicators. And you can only do that when multiple functions within an organization are coming together. So, in my view, what does 55010 provide through a business lens? Processes that actually add value. So it's not just adherence to the process, the intent of the process is known. Leadership and governance, that policy and strategy. And the example I open up with was the New South Wales Treasury policy now states that your AMP is the only business case in which you will get funding from the New South Wales government. And you ain't going to put just numbers in there. We need to see the numbers tied back to the asset register. And if you wish, you can have an asset class strategy within, but do not come to us with a business case separate than the asset management plan. And further to that, we don't even call it in this organization an asset management plan anymore. It's an asset management and services plan, because the S brings out the services, which is TOTEX. It's your operations and your maintenance. Understanding and alignment between asset and financial registers. That's been a big one for the New South Wales government, especially when you think about all the acquisition of land for various purposes. Now we're starting to actually get a sense that having these parcels of land, we can actually share the utilization of that land between different agencies, Couldn't do that before. It was always around control versus value. And then of course, favorite one is, when can we actually have an asset versus non-asset solution? It always used to be, no, can't do that, haven't got the budget for that, or no, can't do that, haven't got the resources for that. Now we actually start with, can we do this with a non-asset solution, and look at different utilization and the funding that it may require. Yeah, it's a new world. Before, even within 2 years ago, let's build something because that's what we do. No. We now realize when we're teamed up with finance that we build stuff, it's going to cost stuff. And it's going to cost not just now, we're not going to pay for it just now, we're going to pay for it later. So what does it provide? Moving from OPEX to COPEX, moving from OPEX and capital to a TOTEX mindset. As I said before, from a change perspective, that isn't just, yeah, I get it, Martin, OPEX plus CAPEX equals TOTEX. The mindset piece is, how does an organization cope with that new concept? All of a sudden, it's not so much time bound. It is, I have this asset worth $10 and it costs me $1 per year to fund in terms of operations and maintenance. Well, if the next year it costs me 90 cents for that same $10, how did that improvement come about? It gives you a compass to find some key measurements. Shifting thinking from just the delivery of stuff to performance and outcomes. When you start to get an organization thinking in terms of outcomes, giving them the principles to work within, again, alignment, assurance, leadership, and value, plus the values of the organization, all of a sudden, they've got that freedom within a framework to shift the performance. And this is probably the biggest and the most fundamental for the work I've been doing with New South Wales government. We have now shifted the pendulum from just planning our, all of our organisational plans being to the available funds. We now shift our thinking to planning to the required need, and then looking at the delta of where the money is in relation to that. Okay, so that has been a huge shift in thinking, a shift in culture. Don't come to me with a plan that accommodates the $1 million you might be getting. Consider that you're getting nothing until you actually can demonstrate that you have got assurance in your asset management system, in your financial system, all the different objectives and the different systems that come together and put up that business case, which is called an asset management plan. And the last point there, report to your stakeholders with meaning. Well, when you actually start planning to the need, when you start shifting to performance and the organization is starting to become aligned, well, then you can report with meaning, because you actually start to shift towards lead indicators, the future. And you can't, well, I'm saying, Martin's saying this, I would find it very difficult for any organization to shift to lead indicator thinking without more than one function being in the conversation. I think it'd be almost impossible. And then from a change management perspective, as I mentioned before, shifting from cost center to an asset cost center and the alignment between the two. And it is a compromise. There's no ERP system out there that can accommodate both perfectly. It's going to be a compromise, but wouldn't it be great if the balance between the two was there? The collection of information, data, is seen as valuable and not just a pain in the butt because you're asking operations to collect information. If you actually remind operations why they are collecting the information and the data, all of a sudden it becomes a new experience for them. And furthermore, when they can feel that the data that they've fed back and those suggestions makes its way back into the next planning cycle, all of a sudden you do increase the alignment and you end up with probably a cultural and a capability lift just doing that. Third point, information, not just data. I hear a lot of organizations say, oh, we need all this data. Well, that can also be a symptom of not understanding the question that you're wanting the answer to. Information is data presented in a particular shape or form or domain that enables you to consider your decision making. Reliability with finance, connecting the two. Think, wow, And I've seen it. I've actually seen the moment that a reliability engineer and the CFO was almost a bromance, that they came together and realized they're after the same thing. Where do I invest? Why do I invest? Where are the symptoms? Where are the causes in the organization? IT projects, very important, acknowledge both asset and finance in their blueprint consideration and how they design a system. I think we've all lived through, or many of us would, the stand up of an ERP that we use, the consultants come in and say that's best practice. Probably best practice for the platform and doing it cost effectively, but does it actually yield value beyond deployment? Creating that conversation between asset and finance to learn from one another. Again, shifting finance from just being control around budget to looking at trends, to looking at future considerations and options. Connecting finance with supply chain, critical, absolutely critical. And further to that, not just with supply chain, but all of a sudden it opens up the door to what is configuration management at an organizational level, as opposed to just being a physical configuration management from an asset manager's lens. Projects shift from moving from just looking at project costs in terms of, say, cost, risk, scope, and quality, but more around cost, risk, and performance. You know, looking at the outcome. What is the intent of this project? Factoring it in. And having an organization that rewards a project for challenging the norms and might ask for more money in the project, not because they couldn't plan, but because they're planning beyond the project into the whole of life perspective. And inviting innovation from younger people who aren't seasoned, you know, they're not seasoned finance or asset, let's just call it cronies or experts. It's amazing some of the insights and some of the fresh lens you get from a young person that says, well, why wouldn't you do this? As humans, we always get ingrained into this is the way we do things. But younger people are able to articulate value, I think, better than a lot of us. Listen to it, feed it back, plan, do, check, and act. And as I said before, I've touched on this a few things, but finance moving from just being controlled to a value assurance function. I can't believe, looking at the clock, that's pretty much coming up to 30 minutes. And I suppose what I wanted to do was, again, give you a bit of a background to 55010, weave that into some of the work I'm doing in my organisation with New South Wales Government, but also looking at the symptoms from a change management lens or perspective. Because really a standard is just a standard, a spec is just a spec. It's how you actually bring that into an organisation that's important. But I can really say group finance, for instance, in New South Wales Transport, they're actually so engaged now with the asset fraternity, saying that, you know what, I've read the standard, we could be doing this, this, and this different. It really has created a catalyst around alignment. And I mentioned before, supply chain, could be anyone in the organisation that has a cost associated with it, which is pretty much everyone. So without trying to oversell 55010, I would go out on a limb and say it's not just around the financial alignment, it's really around organisational alignment. So look, for Tom and Joe, that's pretty much concludes where I wanted to share this afternoon with you in North America. And I suppose I'm happy to open up to any questions or any insights or any challenges from anything that anyone has heard today. I'm happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Well, Martin, this is Tom. I think that I should be able to be heard through the system now. Is that correct?
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear, Tom.
Excellent, thank you. I'm sorry I was late getting on. We had a massive network problem here, and as you might expect, those things never occur until exactly the wrong time. So, but it cleared up about 5 minutes after. It cleared up about 5 minutes after the hour. So I'm happy to be on, and I'm happy to have all of you on. It's quite a large crowd. We had nearly 500 people registered, so and to have 250 on, more than 250 is a wonderful attendance, and I think speaks to the importance of this topic. And it's one that's been I think Martin said you started working on this in your working group in 2015. So this has been around for a while. The fact that the specification was just published last year, we've been talking about alignment for a long time, and it's clearly been a critical issue.
Yeah.
We had a couple questions that I would forward, and then I have my own questions. But I guess the first one is kind of where you've left off. Does the CFO, does the CEO need to understand 55010 to understand alignment?
I think I'll play back a moment in January of this year where we had what we call the Deputy Secretaries of Transport for New South Wales in a room, and we were relaunching asset management again, right, under a different name. And the CFO stood up and said, I don't want to see any more business cases that just look at the now. I want to start seeing business cases expressed in potential and future value. And I know that person, and they have not ever read 55,010 or 55,000. But when that person learned that 55,010 underpinned that statement, she was right on board from that moment.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that tying it directly to the business cases is of the things that I've seen that work. That is one of the most important, and providing really solid templates so that those business cases are presented rigorously by every party, and when people have competing business cases, that they're presented in the same way so that good decisions can be made.
I think too, Tom, on that, whilst I've talked a lot about the asset management plan or the asset management service plan serving as the business case, we shouldn't lose sight that the strategic asset management plan does need to articulate what those objectives are representative of the stakeholders. But as we've said in this, and our new, I suppose, the next iteration of SAMPS in this organisation was also considering our external stakeholders, but also our internal network as a stakeholder as well. So we don't just say yes to everything, we need to afford our decisions as well. So that's also been this latest horizon in thinking.
Yeah. There's another question regarding the specifics, and I've seen a few examples of specific, not both software and kind of procedural examples of how you actually accomplish this alignment. People have to sit down and agree to do it and talk it through. But can you kind of walk us through an example of how technically you actually accomplish the alignment, and how you? I'm sure it's not done in one fell swoop, but how do you work through it and continually verify it so you know that it's working?
Yeah, so I suppose if you picture, you've got an asset register on one side, which is that very technical, probably a product breakdown structure. Then you've got cost centers on another side. The two, I suppose, tactics that one can take, and we're doing this at the moment, is one, go back to your work orders and understand where is it costed against. And then in the asset register, work out what additional field that you could put in there. So during the transaction of a purchase order or works order, you're collecting information against that asset. That's the first step. And it's interesting, once you start talking about, and what I'm referring to is adding metadata to your physical asset register, or adding metadata to your financial asset register, all of a sudden these tags can actually help you within 12 weeks or within a 3-monthly cycle, understand where cost is hitting your respective register and where it is not. To try to go out and say we're going to rebuild the entire chart of accounts around an asset would be almost impossible. We know that there's also regulation around reporting, but just adding a field, but also having finance and asset agree to what that 1 or 2 fields might be, and then look at it after 6 months. It's not a big imposition, and you will get value out of it, but you'll also get value out of agreeing what that field should be. So a bit of I can't go into too much more detail with the time we've got, but that's it. Come together, look at metadata. Okay.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, there were a couple of questions around that line. It's exactly how to do this, and maybe this is something that we should all work on, the ISO group as well. well as IAM and AMC, providing some more detailed examples in another format, perhaps publications, or maybe we would do another webinar with some really real details in it.
Yeah, no, it would be beneficial. Sorry.
Yeah. Another question, do you have any ideas how this works across international boundaries? We've talked a little bit about Australia. Are there, you've been involved with this through your World Partners work and other work globally. Is there any advice as to where you've seen this work well or not well across international boundaries?
Well, look, I won't say
countries?
Yes, I won't say which mining company it is, but there's a mining company I'm actually assisting with certification at the moment for 55001. But what we did at the beginning of it was knowing that they're in a lot of countries around the world, different reporting requirements, different accounting standards, etc. Was one of the requirements was, how do we actually implement asset management at the operational phase without being concerned whether it's accrual or cash? And the underlying secret to that is you simply align to value. And once you align to value, then it takes all that thinking away from the front line and brings that secondary consideration back to finance. Because as I said before, if we keep placing the role of treasurer on the shoulders of an asset manager, you're not going to get the full value out of their knowledge, their insight, and I suppose the craft of asset management. So in a snapshot then, if you align to value, the two fundamentals of asset management, I don't think you can go wrong, because it creates a conversation, and from that you will work out the steps for your organization and how do you come down to that common denominator. Because if you start to localize your practices around asset management to satisfy a financial framework, I think you've lost the game. You need to just come down far enough so if you moved any people around your organization, they could do it consistently. So a bit wordy, and I'm sorry if I didn't nail that on the head, but that is, again, a requirement for this particular organization to achieve value from the discussion around 55010.
So I'm going through the questions. We're getting quite a few. If those of you online have further ones, just type them in, and I'll get through as many as I can in this discussion. And whatever we don't get to verbally in the discussion, we will answer by email individually. And if they seem to be a general question, we will answer them with a general email to everybody on the call. So there will be no questions left unanswered, or at least there will be questions answered to the best of our abilities, I think.
Yeah, I think
here's a question, and
I was just going to say, it sounds like from university you're giving me homework, but that's fine. Happy to turn these questions around for you.
Well, I'll take the first crack at them and call you in for the tough part of it. So yeah, I think it's important that we answer all these questions and that we respect the time and effort and thought of people who are attending. So we will get back to you on this, no question. In terms of maintenance, in terms of Totex, how do you? And I've seen this. I've been at this whole business for a long time, but I see this all the time. How do you get maintenance into the Totex budget? I mean, it's the CapEx stuff, the new shiny objects are so overwhelmingly fascinating. How do you keep maintenance from just taking a back seat? And we could probably all give 100 examples of this, but what's your thought?
No, it's an interesting question, because where I would say is I'd almost think around how do we actually get more services and operational expenditures into our Totex thinking. If I come back to the IAM, if you come back to the asset management plan, historically it has been around buying an asset and maintaining an asset. When you actually have to start figuring that railway platform has got 4 station staff on it, it has got services, it's got vegetation cleanup, it's got all that, you start to bring together the conversation of operations and maintenance. And that's not just to give you a dollar amount of what you need to ask for. What it starts to do is aligning the thinking about, oh, how might I do things to help operations, or how might operations do things to support, maybe it's possession management of an asset from back to maintenance. So everyone on the call, don't just think 55,010 is just a spec in terms of TOTEX on the balance sheet. It's also around aligning behaviors, aligning thinking, and it's like, what else could we do together as opposed to what do I need? And I'm looking down here at a question from Richard Taylor. You mentioned using AMPs as business cases. One of the key things here is, as I mentioned before, with New South Wales Treasury, and we're quite fortunate that the gentleman that blueprinted that policy used to work for Sydney Trains. He was a planner, and he understands that it can't just be about dollars, it needs to be about need. So, and again, our asset management plan in that organization is now called an asset and services management plan, because operations need to sign it off as well as maintenance. So it's created a positive tension, created a positive challenge, and then whilst there might be the executive director above that who is accountable, you've got people below pulling that together. And another key element for you all to consider is, it used to start off with the conversation around, well, whoever's got the asset on their balance sheet owns the budget and is accountable for that asset. We've shifted that thinking now and said, stop for a moment. It really doesn't matter on whose balance sheet it sits on. You are accountable for an asset. Sorry, you are accountable for the value an asset provides your value stream or your stakeholders. So in that also helps breed the concept of TOTEX, because the asset might sit on someone else's balance sheet, but you're using it to provide value for stakeholders. Well, all of a sudden you've got a vested interest in making sure that's funded, even though it's not within your budgetary remit. So that's another element of, again, bringing accountability, alignment, and TOTEX together.
Yeah, that's excellent, and the inclusion of service in there, I think, is really key, because just thinking about a critical facility that we built on campus a few years ago, and it was an endowed facility, sponsored facility, but not quite enough money in the endowment, so they stole from the maintenance budget in order to add the last layer of gold plating onto the facility, but the question was never asked, what does that do to the service level of the asset over time? And that was not the evaluation made. It was how does this look to the sponsor, rather than how does this serve the needs of the users 10 years from now? And so adding that service level in, I think, is really critical.
And I think too, Tom, helping our sponsors understand what the value is they're actually providing, because let's be honest, no one knows everything. They're probably going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and helping our sponsors shift from working on the asset portfolio as opposed to being in the asset portfolio. And the way I explain it to this organization is, asset management is a top-down lens across the entire organization, whereas the management of assets is a discrete consideration bottom up, representing an asset or a system of assets. And once you start to get comfortable between the two, you can shift the conversation around, and then all of a sudden the sponsor goes, great, I'm talking about value then versus talking about functional performance. So we can actually play a role in asset management by just helping, and I don't mean patronizing our sponsors, because they're senior people, but helping them understand value, because it's a pretty straightforward. I'm preaching to the converted here, I know, with you, Tom, but it is. If you help people, value can be anything. Well, then the conversation can be anything without constraints, and I think that's important.
Yeah, there's a question here about why was it necessary to write the technical spec, and why couldn't this simply have been covered in the standard itself?
Well, I suppose if you think, I'll answer the second one first. The standard itself is around the benefits of asset management. those 4 principles or fundamentals, and of course, achieving the desired balance of cost, risk, and performance, plus the coordinated activity of an organization to realize value from its assets. What was the first part of the question again, Tom? Sorry, I just lost myself then.
Why was it necessary to write the technical spec? And
Okay.
not as opposed to trying to just cover it within 5501.
Okay. Well, again, 5501 is a structure of a management system. But if you go back to before 2014, especially when the standard was put out there, and if you typed in the word asset management or the words asset management into Google, you would have come up with funds, investment, managed funds, etc., etc. Over the period of time, that has still been, I think, it's worked for us and against us in asset management. But what 55,010 has done is it brought us inside the organization to link those two together to get that outcome. Because it really is a different discipline. And you know, the term asset management in its own right, or a strategic asset management plan in its own right, is quite confusing. But I think 55,000 by itself is, and again, I'll go back another step and say, when organizations engage me to help them with certification in 01, I said, have you read 00 yet? And if they say, yes, that's why we want to do it, that's a big tick for me. If they say, oh, what's that? Well, then all of a sudden you've got an issue because they don't understand the value that asset management brings. But again, asset management in a finance lens in terms of investments and, you know, buying a building, and you're shifting into a different zone, which is still outcomes for stakeholders, but asset management itself delivers those outcomes. But again, 55,010 links the two together in an explicit fashion, which wasn't available before. Sorry if that was a bit wordy, but I wanted to touch on the fact that asset management typically is seen as funds, portfolios, etc., that people buy shares in to invest, as opposed to the art and the science of asset management.
Yeah, I guess, you know, there's a kind of a related question in terms of if you're just starting on your asset management journey or early in it, what would you do right now if you were just starting? Where would you put 5510 in terms of the guidance for your? I would say, you know, putting it right into the SAMP would be the thing to do, but maybe you have a different take on that.
I think that's a good call, Tom. I mean, if you think a SAMP is really your approach to asset management, if you took a lot of the content and the purpose out of 55,010 and put that in your SAMP, it would actually help the organization understand how the two are mutually supportive, not mutually exclusive. And I think in terms of starting your asset management journey, my advice to anyone would be start with alignment and value. If you're aligned to value, then the other two fundamentals will slowly come together. And I'll also go out on a limb and say, if the boss says, oh, it's going to cost too much money to do asset management, well, if you just let him know that alignment, leadership, and value are free, assurance is where the cost is, and you've got to determine what your level of assurance is based on your context of your organization and your maturity. But yes, 55,010, the substance of that made into the SAMP and in and around sections 4.1 will look at the internal issues and the external issues you're trying to resolve. So yeah, great. That'd be a great starting point, Tom, but aligning to value especially.
Yeah, there's a related question, I think, which is interesting because of the question relates to the interrelationship among assets and the fact that assets, even though they might be in different classes or certainly in different locations, are related to each other, and their performance is interrelated, even though they may be accounted for financially differently. How do you look at performance relations, service relations among assets from a financial standpoint?
Well, I suppose it's like this. No, I was going to say an asset exists to support a system. It doesn't exist to support its own function. Okay, so it sits within a system. That system is delivering a value stream of some type. So it's really understanding the function of that system and the value that it provides, not just the function of the asset in its own discrete manner. And that's another form of alignment. There is no physical asset in any organization that exists outside the system it supports. If it does, well, it shouldn't have it. It's costing you money. It's waste. And that is the other important thing. And then the system is actually owned by perhaps an executive director level because it's delivering service of some type. Once you get that alignment working together and people are aware that one supports the other, not the other way around, again, you get a capability lift. So that's alignment, again, being a fundamental is such an important, as a change person, it's the most important fundamental that I see under 55,000. But again, physical asset only exists to support a function, not the other way around. And that's a strong case then for your executives, for your CFO to really understand the SAMP and then to bring your AMPs to life. So they're not just there as a tick in the box, they're there to create investment decisions in both the immediate and the longer term.
Okay. Let's see. Here's the $24,000 question. How, if you're going to align your two registers, how long does it take and how much does it cost?
$1.50.
I would say $1.50 per field in the database.
Well, I'll start with the question from the other way. What is it costing you not having it? And that then is your business case for investment, and that should determine whether it's worthwhile doing or not. I used one strategy around just placing metadata in either register to link the two together. I looked at even if it was just as simple as adding another field to your works orders. Start to understand how you create alignment. And a big bang of bringing the two together, ouch, that will hurt. That will hurt. But understanding why you do, the cost of not doing it will give you that answer.
Yeah, and I think from what I've seen, this can be done incrementally. I mean, it can be done in one fell swoop if you have a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money and a whole lot of brutal executive support. But I think it can be integrated over time, and that's as you're adding fields and building the two things together.
Yeah. But I suppose another way of looking at it to get senior sponsorship in that particular exercise is to remind people that the system is what generates value or revenue for the organization. If you can put another field down in a register, whichever one it is, to actually create clarity around the decision making in support of that value, I think you'll also get buy-in from your ED. But again, linking it or aligning it back to value will always be a palatable discussion, because a lot of the things when we talk about value, it's very hard to quantify. But if you can talk about it where it's costing us not doing that, that should help.
So when you're selling asset management, now that we have 5510, where does it sit in the, it's a very clear tacit acknowledgement of the relationship. Where does it sit in the business case or in the organizational case for asset management? If you're presenting this to a CEO, and you're talking about the ISO standard in general, where and when do you bring in 55,010?
Well, I suppose it's like this. 55,000 talks about the desired balance of cost, risk, and performance. Maybe 55,010 changes the word desired to optimal because you've got people talking about what the actual goal is. And we need to also, 55,010 helps understand cost, risk, and performance down at the discrete, in the subsystem, in the broader system, and then the value streams of an organization. So again, cost, risk, and performance is the backbone of getting people over the line to at least listen to the opening statement regarding 55,010, because we cannot do things in isolation in an organization. You can't. A small one you can, of course you can. But once you start to get multi-site, different products, different services, you have to have this mindset. You just have to have it.
So we're at 4 o'clock, but we have a lot more questions, and we still have 235 people on the line. So are you willing to go on for another 10 minutes or so, Martin? If we
we even give it 15 minutes down under, because my breakfast won't be ready for 15 minutes. So I'm happy to sacrifice my time while my wife cooks breakfast, Tom. Yeah.
I appreciate that very much. So I think we'll do that. This is a very interesting discussion, and quite a number of probing questions. And we will, as I said, we will get to all of them online or in some other format. Joe Mooney, our communications guy, is on the call. We may actually have to press him into service to write a little white paper in response to all these questions, but we will get there. Tom. I think that might be useful. There's so much here.
Yes.
There's a question about case studies. Several questions about case studies of who has done this, how have they done it, what tools have they used, how much did they spend, etc. And that, Joe, that might fit in with something we would have to put together. But Martin, do you have anything off the top of your head? You talk about your own work with NSW, but
yeah, I think actually I've got a meeting next week with the person who wrote the policy for NSW Treasury, and I think that is a case study in the making, because it's one thing to say, yes, we've got one organization has done it well through leadership, but they've got to get 30 different agencies across New South Wales government to do the same thing. And the case study goes something like this. Policy was signed off last November. This November, you have to demonstrate you've got a plan in place to convert your thinking from planning to spend versus planning to need. And then in March 2021, you actually have to have all your AMPs and SAMs in place that actually tie back to your asset register and provide the request for funding based on cost, risk, and performance. So whilst it's not here today, that is going to be probably a very interesting case study into 2021. But I think all these questions here that I'm reading on the screen are all questions that have come through in different flavors in this journey that's been on. But I also would say to people, a lot of these questions here come back to alignment, assurance, leadership, value, because that's going to be the ingredients for getting this across the line and really getting the value from 55,010. But at least 55,010 is almost like it's finally friendly ground for the, I suppose, below the line part of the organization for finance to above the line in terms of delivery. But look, I work with Budwin in Work Group 3. We actually pull together all the known certifications around the world. I work actively seeking out case studies around 55,001. But I think my discussion, because I've got Budwin in about an hour, is to maybe look at calling upon case studies around 55,010. So that's given me some homework in the longer term, Tom. So I'll take that on board with Budwin. But at the moment, the New South Wales Treasury one would be a real story in the making. There's a lot of people that want this to work, and I feel very privileged to be part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something we can all contribute to. Where it's published, I think there will be multiple publication outlets for this, but and multiple sources for case studies. But there's certainly a discussion that needs to go on and where we need to add some detail. Here's a very interesting, more generic question about registers, and I know that we get caught up in this term register, and the question is, how are registered or organized? There are standard taxonomies that are used, and the register might be, organized under a standard taxonomy, and I've seen that done where the taxonomy is an industry one. Oil and gas has a taxonomy that's standard to the industry. Food and beverage have a food service, a food production standard that is a taxonomy that is standard to the industry. What's your experience around when you try to conceptually to put these two registers together? We can add fields so one can see the other, but is there a long-term solution for making them, for harmonizing them in a more useful way, more intuitive way?
I think that's a two-part question, Tom. I think one is understanding why you would have a register, and I think once people become comfortable with that, the second part of that is, well, what do you have becomes easier, because it's like you say to people, what is it in that? Is that in the asset register? And some might say, oh, it's only we call it equipment if it's in the asset register and it's got maintenance to it, or we call it a discrete asset in the asset register if it's under $500, or we call it a discrete asset if it doesn't have depreciation because it's expendable under a certain tax ruling. This is where it gets muddied. Come back to first principles. What have we got in our asset portfolio that requires funding to keep it of operating value? I mean, as simple as that. Well, what you choose in terms of your taxonomy, like there's one we have in Australia called Auslang, and that ties back to the APIC supply chain standard. There's any that you can use, but whatever you use, make it understandable for anyone in the organization. Think about it as it goes through. You might be able to, if you come up with a standard configuration, how do you actually translate that through your work orders, through your reporting, so people actually understand it's important? I'm doing also work at the moment with digital engineer, what they call it, digital engineering. I said, this is fantastic stuff you've got, but what does it tell me? What does it tell me? It tells me a whole lot of shapes, a whole lot of intersecting things. It's a bit like BIM. BIM's great, don't get me wrong, but what are you capturing? What is it of value? Is it helping you in a future design, a future decision, risk, cost, performance? If it isn't, you'd question it. But I think coming back to first principles, what do we have? Where is it? And what do we need to know about it? The third question is certainly one that the organization's appetite and maturity will answer. But I think anyone who's investing anything in terms of cost should know what it is. You'll get into the whole argy-bargy regarding recurrent cost, or if it's vegetation cleanup, how do I distribute that across different assets? Well, you might choose not to. You might just say, you know what, we'll just factor that in over there. And if it gets more in over the next year or less, we'll start to look at it differently. But if we start making this too scientific, too logical, we'll lose the purpose of doing this. It's about decision making, and you should only need to go down as far as you're going to be making an effective decision. So again, it was a generic question, as you said, and a bit of a waffling answer there, Tom, but the organization has to decide that for itself, but it needs to understand the questions that it needs to ask in terms of investment.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I like that answer. Well, I like the answer a lot, and I was thinking about a case. This seems like a minor case, but a large parks department, a large city parks department, multi-million inhabitants, and the equipment and facilities in the park seem to be like, okay, we've got playgrounds and swing sets, and we maintain them at a certain level. But what they've noticed is, as the population changes and ages, there are not too many octogenarians out on the swing sets anymore. So you might as well pick those up and move them to another another location where the neighborhood has changed and needs them. But that requires some future, as you said earlier, some future thinking. The people who manage this have to look not just at what are we spending today, but okay, you know, maybe every 10 years we make an assessment as to whether we need to pick this stuff up and move it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's can we afford the decisions tomorrow that we make today, etc. Little adages like that. But it's also, will the asset, I'm also amazed too sometimes when people still look at this asset. It needs to be there for as long as we can afford it to be there. And you kind of say, well, really? I said, maybe that asset, we could do a lot more with the funds we save from making it a shorter life asset, because something else might come along and replace it. But it seems to be a lot of organizations aren't brave enough to admit, yes, we'll just terminate it at that point in time and that's okay. So that hard time replacement shouldn't just be done on condition. Hard time replacement should also be seen as part of your business case in the first instance. Be brave enough to understand the system it represents and be bold around that, because again, a lot of the decisions that we find that operations and maintenance are making at the coalface in terms of asset replacement and renewals, we should have decided that back before they were even designed. You know, and an organization designing the outcome or a solution, not just engineering detailed design. Everyone has to do it together. Sorry, I waffled.
Interesting. No, I think that's incredibly good answer. We're going to take one last question here, and then I think we will let you get off to breakfast. And we do have quite a bit of homework here, so we'll follow through with this from a variety of standpoints, but we'll make sure that we get back to everyone who has asked questions. And there's certainly work here for Bodwin's working group within the technical committee of ISO, but there's also work for IAM and AMC in terms of supporting their members with answers to these kinds of questions. So
Yes.
I'll make a promise to stay on this. We're really getting to the rubber and the road here with this technical spec in ways that make asset management real to another whole spectrum of the organization. So the last question is, you talked about building a business case that considered the assets and the services that they perform and the value of those services. What is the follow-up then on that business case? So I make a Totex business case. I'm going to move my swing sets. And so what is the follow-up there? The ISO standard does require that we do audit and review. Are we just writing reports at the end of this that says we did it right? Or how does this all get woven back into the audit and the management review function?
Well, I think audit and management review are quite a nice little balance there. If you think about assurance, it's assurance to a plan. Did I comply with the plan I set out to do? But probably more important, the assurance says, did I achieve the intent of the plan as I set out to do? So the former might be around the cost, but the latter is around performance, and in between is that risk. But in terms of that Totex view of the world, again, try not to dwell on the fact that it's OPEX plus CAPEX. Look at it as creating a conversation that's future bound. It's bringing operations in closer with maintenance. It's bringing maintenance closer with operations. It's inviting supply chain in. It's inviting HR and around competency development. It's the whole gamut. It's not just funds, it's value. And value to an organization could also be the consideration of the octarian being repurposed, as you say, Tom. Look at what the skills of that person is and making sure that in the future, under that asset and services management plan, that I've actually factored in training for these people or a change in workforce to support something. I mean, if you think about the example I provided today was on the back of New South Wales Transport, how are we going to cope with autonomous vehicles? We need alignment, and alignment that actually stops looking at what could go wrong and look at what could go right and how we fund that. And the operational considerations for, say, autonomous vehicles coming online, we've got to upskill a lot of people, or maybe we don't. But we can only do that when we start coming together and thinking about things. Because one thing I really have taken a lot of pleasure out of the AMP moving to an asset management and services plan is you can't do it in isolation now. You're forced to do it with other members of the organization, which is very much the DNA of 55010. So maybe all of you, next time you're doing an asset management plan, invite services in your operations in and say, this is what I'd like to do. This is my maintenance regime. And you might say, look, in this, I need 5 days possession of this asset. Could I do this differently? Could we model this differently? The external stakeholders in maintenance, noise, vibration, whatever it might be. Do I consider my local community? Let's factor that in. But the business case, again, should always be factored around value, not just TOTEX. TOTEX is a result of understanding the value that you're trying to deliver.
Well, that's great. I really appreciate this. Really, we all appreciate this, your time and your expertise and the thought you put into doing this. It's been very, very, very informative, very useful. And as I said to the audience, we'll follow up with individual answers, and maybe that will take the form of a document that we put our heads together and generate for all of those who attended. But we will, the session is recorded. You can review it later with your, if anybody subscribed, we'll get a link to the recording so they can review it later. And obviously we as I say, if we put a report out, we will see if we can find a way to continue this discussion. My guess is that another webinar would be welcome, and we may look for a different kind, slightly different focus for it. But we've certainly hit on a very a very hot topic, a very powerful topic for everybody involved. And again, I didn't introduce myself. My name's Tom Smith. I'm one of the directors of the IAM USA and a member of the ISO Standards Committee, and also have been coordinating webinars on behalf of the IAM North America, along with Bodwin, who is the chair of the Canadian chapter. So we will have another webinar in a couple weeks. We're going to talk about using a SAMP to develop consensus across the organization. And I'm going to guess that we can throw 5510 into that mix when we may have that discussion. So look forward to seeing many of you back for another session. And thanks again to Martin. Any last words, Martin, that you want to have to say?
I would just like to first thank you for the privilege to come and speak to our North American cousins. I mean, it doesn't matter whether I'm in the Asset Management Council, ISO, IAM, we're all on the journey together. I think sharing is caring. And for those of you who are getting on the journey of asset management, please start with 55,000 first before getting into the detail of 01, because it really understanding those key core fundamentals is what helps drive the conversation and the uptake of asset management. But again, thank you very much for today. It's been great. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you again. And with that, I will close the session and say goodbye to you all, and good luck with the rest of the day.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you.